Right now, without looking anything up, picture a Viking. Go ahead. Big guy, beard, axe, longship. And on his head, you gave him horns, didn't you? Almost everybody does. It's one of the most automatic images in your entire brain. You've never had to learn it. It was just always there, the same way you know what a dinosaur looks like, or a pirate. Here's the problem. Archaeologists have been digging up Scandinavia for over 200 years. Thousands of graves, thousands of warriors buried with their weapons, their tools, their ships. And out of all of it, there is exactly one complete Viking Age helmet. One. And it doesn't have horns. Maybe you've heard that part before. It's become a fun fact people like to correct each other with at parties, but almost nobody knows the next part, and it's much stranger. Because horned helmets from Scandinavia do exist. Real ones. Not drawings, not replicas. Actual metal helmets with actual horns on them, pulled out of the actual ground, sitting in a museum in Copenhagen right now, where you can go and look at them today. So if the horned helmet is a myth, why can you go see one? And if it's real, whose head was it on? Let's open the file. Wait, hit subscribe and smash that like button before we continue. Start with how deep this image is buried in you, because it's deeper than you think. There's an American professional football team, the Minnesota Vikings, whose entire visual identity since 1961 is a horn on the side of a helmet. Millions of people watch that logo every Sunday. In 1973, a cartoonist named Dick Brown launched a comic strip called Hager the Horrible about a scruffy Norwegian raider in a horned helmet, and it ran in newspapers for more than 50 years. Walk into any costume shop in October, ask for a Viking, and you will be handed a plastic head with two horns glued to it. Nobody has to explain it to you. The costume works because the image is already installed in every person who sees it, and that is the part worth sitting with. This isn't a small error in a textbook somewhere. It's a picture that hundreds of millions of people carry around, in dozens of countries, across 4 or 5 generations, with total confidence and no source. Because here's the thing about that image. It is not ancient. It's younger than photography. It's younger than the telephone. There are buildings on your street older than the horned Viking. The Vikings raided, traded, and settled across Europe for roughly 300 years. Not one person who actually met them ever wrote down that they wore horns. Not the English monks who watched them come ashore and had every reason to describe them as monsters. Not the Frankish chroniclers. Not the Arab diplomats who met Norse traders on the Volga and left long, detailed descriptions of how they looked, what they wore, and how badly they smelled. Everyone who was actually there somehow forgot to mention the horns. So let's go to the ground and look at what's actually in it. In 1943, on a farm at Yermanbu in Norway, a farmer clearing a burial mound hit iron. What came out of that grave, in 17 rusted fragments, was reassembled into the only complete helmet ever recovered from the Viking Age in Scandinavia. And it is a beautiful, serious piece of equipment. A rounded iron bowl built from 4 plates riveted into a frame of iron bands. A thick nasal bar running down from the brow to protect the nose, widening into a spectacle-shaped guard that wraps around the eyes. It's the helmet of someone who expected to be hit in the face. There is no crest. There are no wings. There are no horns. And here's what makes that single helmet so damning. The Vikings drew themselves, constantly. They carved warriors into memorial stones, stamped them onto metal foils, hammered them into jewelry, stitched them into textiles. We have a whole body of Viking Age images of Viking Age fighters made by Norsemen, for Norsemen. Almost none of them are wearing horns. Then there's the practical side, which historians raise carefully, because it seems like a bad idea. It's an argument, not a proof. But think about the actual job. Viking battle tactics lean on standing shoulder to shoulder in a shield wall packed tight, with your neighbor's shield overlapping yours. Now bolt 2 horns onto everyone's head. In that formation, they don't intimidate the enemy. They hit your friends. They snag on rope and rigging on a crowded ship deck, and in a fight, a horn is a handle, something for an opponent to grab, twist, and use to rip your head sideways. Nobody who fought for a living for 3 centuries was going to keep wearing that. So if the men themselves didn't wear horns, and the people who met them never described horns, and the ground has never produced a Viking helmet with horns, where did your mental picture come from? We can actually name the culprits. The trail runs through 19th century Scandinavian Romanticism, a period when Northern Europe fell in love with its own Norse past and started dressing it up. In 1868, the Swedish painter August Malmström illustrated an edition of Frithiof's Saga, an enormously popular romantic poem about a Viking hero. Malmström's warriors wear helmets with small horns curling off the sides. He wasn't documenting anything. He was doing what illustrators do, making a hero look like a hero. Then, 8 years later, it went from a book to a stage, and the stage is what made it permanent. In 1876, Richard Wagner premiered the complete ring cycle at Bayreuth. The costumes were designed by a German artist named Karl Emil Deppler. Deppler did his homework in the sense that he visited museums and looked at what 19th century scholars believed was Norse gear, but his actual assignment wasn't accuracy. His assignment was to make gods and heroes readable from the back row of an opera house. So on the head of the warrior hunting, Deppler put horns. The Yale scholar Roberta Frank traced this whole chain, and she found something that should stop you cold. Before Wagner, Vikings in European art usually weren't drawn with horns at all. They were drawn with wings. Wings were the romantic, noble option. Horns belonged to a different category entirely. Horns were for barbarians, for Gauls, for ancient Britons, for the wild tribes at the edge of the civilized world. Within about 20 years of that opera, the horns had spread everywhere, into advertisements, into paintings, into children's books. One costume designer, one night, one production, and the image outlived him by a century and a half. Which brings us back to the helmets in Copenhagen, because those are real, and we've been putting off the question long enough. In 1942, pit cutters working a bog at Bronze Moss, near the Danish village of Viksø, dug up 2 bronze helmets with enormous curved horns. They are magnificent, theatrical objects, sweeping horns like the horns of an auroch, the huge wild cattle that once roamed Europe. And they're decorated, raised shapes suggesting the eye, and hooked beak of a bird of prey. Traces of birch tar on the horn tips suggest something was fixed there, probably feathers. For decades, everyone assumed these were Viking. They looked exactly like the picture in everyone's head. Then modern radiocarbon dating got hold of them. The Viksø helmets were placed in that bog around 900 BC, not 900 AD, 900 years before Christ. Roughly 1500 years before the first Viking longship ever touched an English beach. Those helmets are further away in time from the Vikings than the Vikings are from us, and they were almost certainly never worn in a battle. They're heavy, they're fragile, they're decorated to be looked at, and they were deliberately deposited in a bog, which in Bronze Age Northern Europe is what you did with an offering to a god, not with your combat kit. Now look at what shows up later. On the Torslanda plates from Sweden, metal dies from the 6th or 7th century, a century or two before the Viking Age proper. There's a figure that has haunted people for 150 years. A dancing man carrying spears, wearing a horn headdress. Except when you look closely, the horns don't end in points, they end in bird heads. And one of the figure's eyes has been deliberately removed from the design. A one-eyed figure, 2 birds. Any Norse audience knew exactly who that was. Odin, who traded an eye for wisdom, and who kept 2 ravens. That is not armor, that is a priest, or a god, or a man dressed as a god in a ritual, and the horns are the costume that makes him more than a man. So the honest version of the story isn't there were no horned helmets in Scandinavia. There were. There's even one ambiguous horned figure woven into a tapestry from the Augsburg ship burial, from inside the Viking Age itself. The honest version is that horns were sacred equipment, not military equipment. They were what you wore to stand in front of a god. And then, over centuries, that meaning drained away and left nothing behind but a shape. And in the 19th century, when Malmström and Doppler were working, there was no radiocarbon dating. There was no way to know that the horned helmet coming out of a Danish bog was 15 centuries older than the man they were drawing. All they saw was horns from the north, from the ground. Close enough. So here's what actually happened. The horned Viking helmet isn't a forgery. Nobody made it up out of nothing. It's a real object, put on the wrong head in the wrong century by people who had no tools to know better, and then repeated so many times that it stopped needing evidence at all. But there's one more thing, and it's the part I can't quite shake. Remember what Roberta Frank found, that before Wagner, horns weren't the Viking look. Horns were what you drew on barbarians. And in medieval Christian art, horns had an even more specific job. Horns marked the demonic, the pagan, the thing outside the light. So when 19th century Europe finally reached for a way to draw the Norsemen, out of everything available, the ships, the astonishing navigation, the trade routes that ran from Baghdad to Newfoundland, the poetry, the law courts, it reached for the horns. Not because the evidence pointed there, because the horns said what people already wanted to say about them. Godless, savage, not us. The helmet is real. The horns are real. What's invented is the man underneath, and he was invented by people who needed the Vikings to look like monsters, which leaves an uncomfortable question for the rest of us. That instant, effortless picture in your head, the one you didn't have to learn, how many of those are like this one? Not rise exactly, just a real thing, quietly moved onto the wrong person, 1500 years off, and left there because nobody thought to check. File closed on the horned helmet. Next time, we open a file on a mountain. In 79 AD, Vesuvius buried Pompeii. Today, roughly 700,000 people live inside the official red zone at its base, and Italy's national evacuation plan needs 72 hours to get them out. Naples sits about 12 kilometers from the crater. A pyroclastic flow crosses that in minutes. So what actually happens if Vesuvius wakes up tomorrow? That's next on Glitch Files. History has glitches. We find them. File closed. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.